I think the guys put me on last because they want me to put everybody in Australia and New Zealand to sleep just before they go to bed. So I'll crack on from here. So we're going to talk about a rec fem repair in a sprint athlete. But just on my own personal history of rec fem, so prior to getting involved in physio and sport, working in sport, I played Gaelic football, so similar to Aussie Rules, and isn't that a chronic recurrent rec fem history. So probably around 6 tears bilaterally. End up myositis ossificans developed in both proximal rec fem. So missed around about 12 months out. So for me, rec fem, big important injury in terms of recurrent, and it's probably the worst muscle in terms of muscle injury recurrence. Talk about our case. So this lady is she's on lane 6 over and around on the left hand side. You can see Daphne Skippers ends up winning the race. She ended up the 200-meter champion or silver medalist in Rio. However, the most important thing isn't the time. I think the time the athlete ended up, she are coming through here into second place, like a train, finishing really, really strongly. But the most important thing is probably the wind speed, so minus 3.1. So our athlete came through at about 11:28, put into a minus 3.1 headwind. So that's around about 11:0, 11:1, which is really, really shifting. So really high level athlete. However, had a chronic history in terms of hip pathology, some lower abdominal stuff, and in and out of training, I would say wouldn't have a high level of chronicity in terms of training. And then unfortunately, prior to Rio 2016, had a big blowout in terms of her rec fem, and then missed the Olympic Games. Come back in 2017. I started working with her in January, and throughout the whole season, just recurrent symptoms. Struggled particularly with top end maximal velocity work, and eventually in August 2017 had surgery. I went into the surgery. The indirect head of the rec fem was really bad. So she ended up having a tenodesis, indirect head to direct head. So then we're getting into rehab. So her anatomy has changed absolutely in that rec fem. So she had 2 beds. Now 2 heads are better than 1. We had Batman and Robin. Now we just got Batman. So we have to make Batman incredibly bulletproof. So what are her requirements to get her back to the level she is capable of? And that's that's our main. Let's go through that, and then we can reverse engineer where we need to get to. So requirements in sprinting involve big, massive ranges in terms of hip and around the hip. So you end up in 30 to 40 degrees of extension. Then there's this large eccentric contraction at the end range extension, and brings you through to about 80 degrees of flexion. So this is the 2017 World Championships Biomechanical Study, freely available online, and the amount of resources is incredible within it. So you see this is the World Championship final race. These girls are doing swing times in terms of 0.3 seconds. So they're going from 30 to 40 degrees of extension through to 80 degrees in about 0.3 of a second. Then again, you see that within sprinting at end range swing, they go through the largest angular velocity at their hip in extension, and then approximately the same time they go through the largest angular velocity at their knee in terms of flexion. So we're talking about end range Thomas test position, around about the same time. So for our biarticular muscle at the rec fem, so massive incredible strain going through the rec fem, and this is why we see so many rec fem injuries in sprinting and running based field sports. Then we go into some more sprinting requirements. So these ladies have a step length, so from toe off to toe off from one side to the other, of around about 2.2 meters. So big, large force absorption and generation. It's essentially an alternate bound mechanism. But these ground contacts are very, very brief and very, very quick. So about 0.1 of a second. However, they're doing these around 4.5 to 5 hertz, so 4.5 to 5 steps per second. So they're going through massive ranges in terms of around the hip, huge angular velocities at 2 joints through this rec fem, and then they're doing that 4 to 5 times per second. So now you start to understand why the rec fem is so susceptible to injury, and particularly within sprint athletes. So hip mechanics and sprinting, Nagahara's work, there's lots of fantastic work coming out of Japan in terms of sprint mechanics and research, probably in the lead up to Tokyo, and they're really developing their research and top end stuff. But Nagahara's work, power from the hip increases until max velocity, and negative eccentric hip work also increases until max velocity. So the authors concluded then that negative work and power around the hip is responsible for increased speed until max velocity. So if you want to run quickly, you have to be extremely powerful and strong and aggressive around your hips. Again, that's what we talk about in terms of speed being developed distally or proximally to distally. Again, Elizabeth Chumanov's work with Brian Heiderscheid's group, who spoke earlier, rec fem particularly important in the early swing phase. And then again, highly active late swing or in pre-tension prior to ground contact, the two main spikes we see in rec femorous activity. Okay. Other authors again concur with these sentiments. So the proximal rec fem is primarily responsible for hip flexion, the proximal aspect of the rec fem. So again, Haggio's work. Initiate swing, again, at outer range swing for generating that initial movement. And again, Mero and Comey back in 1987 talk about it being more of a hip flexor than knee extensor within sprinting. But these ladies, again, I'm working in field-based sports now, and the velocities these girls are reaching is incredible. They're reaching 10.7, 10.8 max velocity, meters per second max velocity. I'm working as field sports. Our guys are getting low 10s maximally, and we got some quick enough guys. So these girls would absolutely smoke a field-based, an elite level soccer player. Never mind talking about the guys, okay? In terms of how do we overcome this? So we know now what we need to do to get back and get competing well. How do we overcome it? In terms of, we've got lots of requirements that this tendon is going to have to be able to do before it's to get strong enough and to be able to compete. Lots of different things: stiffness, rapid contractions, eccentric, work tolerance, strength endurance. Need to simplify into what we can achieve. So early in the rehab, we're going to focus on tendon capacity and cross-sectional area. Later in the rehab, we're going to start ramping it up a bit. We're going to get into force generation, tolerance, and transfer, and then into stiffness and reactivity later on. But it's also really key to assess regularly and see where you're at. I think particularly physios are a wee bit reluctant to objectively mark where they're at early, middle, late, and repetitively throughout the rehab. No reason why not. It gives you a roadmap of where you're going, where you need to do. You've had an intervention, see was it correct? Was your hypothesis correct in terms of what you wanted to achieve? So come back, reassess, plan again. So for cross-sectional area and capacity, we're going to do some hypertrophy work in terms of the gym, and also some occluded work, so blood flow restricted training. In terms of force generation and transfer, maximal strength work or heavier strength work, high force isometrics, and eccentric loading. Later in the rehab, reactivity, again, high force isometrics, some plyometrics, and sprinting, which is probably the most plyometric and best training of all. So obviously the anatomy's changed. How do we harness everything we need to help compromise this tissue and this movement? Okay. What else can we harness to try and make this better and take some pressure off this compromised tendon? So again, Emma's work from Japan, trained sprinters have higher hamstring and adductor and rectus femoris cross-section area compared to untreated individuals. So what can we do within it? So only the rec fem, within Emma's work, only the rec fem cross-section area correlated to essentially being fast and peak hip flexion moment. So looking at the hip or the kinetic chain as a whole, can we get some assistance above proximally the compromised area? Of course we can. We're going to hypertrophy around the hip flexion muscle group. So we're going to hypertrophy TFL. We're going to hypertrophy around the adductors. We're going to hypertrophy psoas. We're going to make the lower abdominals incredibly strong. And there was a history there. We're going to do a lot of transverse rotation to work through the internal and external obliques and the transversals of abdominals. Utilize all those, the whole kinetic chain above the area. And distally, we can also do the same. So Peter Wayne's work from the biological limits of running and posting the ground up. The number one component or determinant of speed is force into the floor. How much force you can put into the floor and how much you can transfer into the floor. Libram Ward, Soleus has huge cross-sectional area and force development characteristics, which can be very helpful for us in terms of push-off. So if we are very stiff through our foot and we're able to push up very well through our leg and shank, it can take some pressure off that hip flexion moment, that early stage swing, which we know is where the rec fem's working extremely hard. If you're very quick and powerful off the floor, it can take a lot of pressure off the rec fem. And foot strengthening drills. So within track and field, there's a lot of intrinsic work, and in ballet, intrinsic foot strengthening within sand drills and on track. That's not done in other sports, but really, really useful, particularly around the midfoot and the first ray. So early management in terms of this injury, protect or repair. Do not get too excited. So you probably can't have a successful rehab in the first few weeks of a long-term rehab, but you can definitely have an unsuccessful one. So protect the repair. Make sure the tendon is nice and moving well, well protected, scar tissue mobilizing well. And we are going to get into some muscle mass, some blood flow restricted work, whether you use protocols in terms of 3 or 4 per week, or you use a 8-day, twice per day protocol. Lots of protocols out there, and try and error, see which one works with their schedule and better. But blood flow restricted work is really nice in terms of this compromised structure cannot tolerate the load. Atrophy is going to limit us. The loading needs required for hypertrophy. So the blood flow restricted work is a really nice stimulus that potentially could suit us. Utilize it early and utilize it often. In terms of cross-section area incapacity, hypertrophy strength training is actually not a bad time to integrate very early in rehab. The intensity of the actual training isn't all that high. It's lower loads, higher repetitions, lower recovery, and it actually suits. Also really important for me in terms of rec fem is not just focusing on top end maximal force and torque, but also strength endurance within the rec fem. So short reps, whether for time, whether for repetition number, short recovery, next exercise. So I'll go into full view and let's move on. So here's some examples. So hurdle walkovers with hands on hips, really hard work for lower abdominals and inner range hips, hip flexors. Athlete has to use a really common drill within track and field, and so they'll be well used to it, but also you're getting your stimulus of what they would like. Some cable resisted work, relatively light load, but probably I can't remember the time, but I'm probably doing relatively high repetitions and short recovery. And again, encouraging whole kinetic chain involvement, stronger through the stance leg. I'm also encouraging her to bring her ankle through quite far, so you have activation through the rectus femoris the whole way through the range. Some mountain climbers, but in a TRX position, again, lower abdominal, hard work for inner range hip flexors as well. Toes up. Encouraging toes up, because that's what she'll do when she's running. And also some pulley work. So within this, I'm not focusing on all that much on the eccentric component, but I am focusing on driving through quite quickly from eccentric to concentric.
Yes, drive it through the trunk.
Turn it round really quick at the back. Light load on there is probably high reps. So regular needs analysis and seeing where we're at. Around about week 8, I think we had an assessment and looked at hip flexion isokinetic dynamometry or jumps. Hip flexion dynamometry was okay in a range. Outer range probably around 11% down. So after working in outer ranges, so we initially had been protecting it. That's really natural and really normal. Jumps symmetry was like good in terms of power output, but the rate of force development on that left side needed work. So solutions, rate of force development work, plyometrics, getting back and getting a bit more reactivity into that tendon and not that side. So other mechanisms, other assessments, isometric mid-thigh pull, knee extension on the side backs or dynamometer, adductor strength, hamstring monitoring, all your number 2s. Take regular assessments, see where you're at, replan, go again. So here's a sample of one of our high force kind of, you're putting the athlete into a bit of a hole now in terms of a max strength kind of block. So here's a heavy quarter squat, low box step up, but heavy, and big heavy sumo deadlift. You're also going back into some isometric work and then some isometric or eccentric work. In terms of split squat progressions, lots of split squat stuff done for rec fem, particularly in the hip flexors. Here's some little progressions in terms of gym-based stuff, so how I rationalize which one I'm doing and why. So a static one is nice for technique and load, probably very earlier in the rehab. Bulgarian, increased range, so you're getting a wee bit more of a different stimulus at a bigger range. Reverse has a much bigger eccentric load, so a reverse split squat. So they have to decelerate the body weight, whatever load they're carrying, their body weight, and also gravity. So drop split squats, so really quick drops and holds and sticks, really high eccentric load. Tough strength speed exercise. And then complexes such as like jerk variations, Bosch type drills where reverse lunge to box block, those types of things. So here's a week 8 sample. So coach was very good in terms of, he understood that this athlete had a tough time in terms of injury, and he allowed us to prioritize, or he agreed to prioritize that the gym-based loading was incredibly important for this athlete at that moment in time, around the trunks, hips, and that type of thing. So the athlete ran on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, so only 3 days a week, and allowed us to really focus on the gym-based loading. Also, the coach went from a long to short approach, so he was doing longer type work, so less intensity, so it didn't interfere as much with our training in terms of the gym. So really good buy-in from the coach. And actually James Moore, who was speaking earlier, he worked with the coach and athlete before, and he was fantastic at developing buy-in. But you can see they're doing a high force session early in the mornings on the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then later in that afternoon they're doing a second accessory work gym-based session, and that could be rec fem stuff or whatever the case may be. Really tough block of training. High force isometrics, so promote tendon adaptation properties via cross-sectional area and stiffness. Really high force, high intensity, and the time under tension is incredibly important. So Sebastian Bone's work looking at the tendon adaptation to exercise, and they really, their meta-analysis just come up with the mode of contraction is less important, but what is the intensity. Has to be above 80% of max voluntary contraction. Some work from, there's been lots of work in terms of tendon adaptation in hamstrings, particularly the guys down in Queensland, Ryan Timmins, Matt Bourne, Anthony Shield, great work. Here's some work from Anthony Blazovic in terms of eccentric loading with respect to quadriceps. Fantastic paper. So The diagram on the left has got concentric exercise. So essentially, the studies concentric exercise, eccentric exercise over a course of 10 weeks, looking at the adaptation following two different groups. So the left side has the concentric group in the above and the eccentric group below. So within the quadriceps group, we see an increased angle of peak torque with the eccentric group, not with the concentric group. So again, really important for us in terms of if we need that rec fem to be very strong in the outer ranges, and if it's really important in swing, which is almost end range Thomas test position, this is going to be an important movement for us, an important modality of strength training for us. In terms of concentric and eccentric, in terms of overall force, slightly the groups were looked a little bit skewed from the start, but anyway, what we did see is that the eccentric group detrained a lot quicker than the concentric group. So there's no point doing an eccentric block and then just leaving it. You need to maintain within after having done it. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we were doing our big eccentric work, and it's actually really difficult to get proximal eccentrics of very high level of force and intensity. Very difficult. So we done a manual eccentric in between two boxes. So you start at inner range and you gradually control the outer range. Manually resisting against the athlete. We've done an isometric, again, 3 different ranges, inner, middle, and outer. And then we use the K box to really high level. So I would overspeed the flywheel to get a little bit of an eccentric overload, but really hard work, so that's in an almost a 45-degree forward line, less than 45 degrees, a forward lean position, really driving through very, very hard exercise. And actually poor mechanics almost helps in that situation because you're putting the rec fem under in a bigger range and working harder in the outer range. So at this stage, we're starting to do a lot more track-based work and sprint drilling. And for me, sprint drilling, just the way I think of it, it's a coordinating pattern of movement similar to the stimulus of what they do in their normal training, whilst they're not able to do that. So you can get high forces and and large contraction velocities, but in a controlled manner. And it's really, really nice to do it early within the rehab. However, within this athlete, their mechanics, the front side mechanics is absolutely crucial. If they get into bad positions on track, where they're really outer ranges, it's going to be killer for them. Very, very hard if they keep on. So within our cueing, it's our massive main thing is our front side mechanics. So key drilling principles in terms of visually, in terms of ground contact, we're looking at a neutral foot angle and also a vertical shin angle for max velocity work or positive shin angle for acceleration. And pre-tension, we're cueing pre-tension upon ground contact. So this guy is a world-class 200-meter runner. He's going to do what's called a dribble bleed, and it gradually increases in load in terms of the impacts become greater, gradually larger. So he'll be initially from above his ankle, then he'll go to mid shin, and then he'll go to knee. So watch gradually as the foot contacts become gradually bigger and gradually larger. So it's small, bit bigger, and now he's starting to come up to knee. But nice neutral foot angle, crisp contact. See how crisp the contacts sound. In terms of swing and stance, so stance, incredibly important that it's from proximal to distal, and that it's brief but extremely powerful. Okay, and then early initiation of swing upon after a hard ground contact. So again, front side mechanics. Okay, and that scissor leg Bosch flexion extension reflex that we talk about. So this athlete, the different female athlete, and let's watch how crisp and how brief her contacts are off the floor. And there's very little negative backside mechanics. Everyone's hit the floor, get in front. Hit the floor, get in front. Boom, 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 boom. Lovely. And then you can change this drill and have arms involved like we're doing now, which is more technical. If you want to make it more metabolic or in more of a strength-based stuff, you can do hands on hips, dial up the shoulders, dial overhead. So coming towards later stage rehab, we're starting to potentially get away more from a rehab perspective and go into more of a performance perspective. So the coaches become a lot more involved. He's involved the whole process, but he's starting to lead the process a bit more. The coach is an incredibly smart guy. He's able to provide context, but you have to be able to justify. And I think physios and medical guys were inherently a little bit safe in terms of how we progress things. My main focus was that I want him to maintain eccentric loading or tendon loading post whenever the athlete goes back into more or less full training, and maintain the accessory work that we had done. So lots of the trunk, the lower abdominal, foot stiffness, and it's up to us, for me and the coach and the athlete, to come together and fit that into their program. But again, before we're starting to go fully flat out and starting to really shift, we need to reassess. Is this athlete capable of tolerating high intensity running? So the British Athletic Muscle Injury classification has been used by ourselves in terms of hamstring injury rehabilitation and what that means for a myofascial, a musculotendinous junction, and an intratendon injury. And I think that actually applies quite well to rectus femoris injuries. So within that, we potentially would do strength diagnostics like we have been doing. We'd look at biomechanics in terms of ground contact and stride length. Are they back to previous levels? Clinical examination, obviously. Also, what running has they done, and is there a level of chronicity there that they're able to tolerate higher intensities? And MRI and ultrasound may be helpful before you go back to higher intensity running. So here's some examples. Resisted acceleration work. Again, the athlete is in trainers, so there's no spikes. So spikes on track means a lot more traction, so it's a lot more intensity. So the athlete's in trainers and doing a resisted work, so nice hip flexion stuff and progressions of higher level acceleration. Then we have an acceleration, but again on grass, so again don't have that maximal traction of spikes and on track, but a lot crisper here. Getting through, I think she goes out to about 20 or 30 meters here. 3-point start, starting to look a lot crisper. Moving really, really well. And then you start to progress back on track in spikes. Here she's working with a partner, so that level of competition has gone up. Just having a training partner there's always somebody to race, so that inherently just comes in. And the athlete she's recently running with here, she had a stumble there, the other athlete, but she's actually very quick from the blocks. And then you're starting to integrate into max velocity, so acceleration and max velocity. This is an example of flying 30, but from blocks. So the athlete runs 30 meters, 20 to 30 meters fairly maximally, and within 30 meters, her top end speed is being measured. So it's really an assessment of top end running. And I think she runs through to about 80 meters then in the end. So the last 20 meters is just more speed endurance. Drive out, hold. There's the timing gates through. So flying 30s are a big indicator of max velocity, used by a lot by speed coaches. But you have to be going through the gates absolutely flat out. So in terms of overall learnings, the athlete come back 2018, solid year, injury free, and with confidence. She didn't set the world on fire, but she got her confidence back. 2019, back to form. She was world relay silver medalist and getting back into her groove. This year, prior to the shutdown for Tokyo, the athlete was absolutely flying. I'm looking forward to seeing where they go. In terms of learnings, respect the proximal rec fem tendon tears. They are a bugger for recurrence, from personal experience and as a professional experience. My learning, they probably should have integrated stress shortening cycle and plyos a little bit earlier, obviously in a sensible manner, but probably earlier within the rehab. Regular signposting, like we talked about, and getting direction of where to go. And the track based loading and the S&C integration is incredibly important. If they're not symbiotic, you're really, really struggling. And the relationship's key. Coach we got on really well. Plenty of fights, plenty of arguments. We kept that away from the athlete, but really good guy, really good to develop a relationship, and also with the athlete. Some future stuff. We have some common research, and hopefully in the next few months, the British Athletic Muscle Injury Classification, we have utilised it for rec fem injuries. So from 2010 to 2019, we have 38 rec fem injuries in 27 athletes. So proximal, by the way, this is future work. Please do not tweet it out, or it's unpublished yet, and we're hopefully going to get it out in the near future. Proximal, the most commonly injured, proximal third of the rec fem, 80% plus. In terms of conservative management, around 20 days was the average in terms of all grades when they're combined, and surgical, which one of these cases we're talking about here, was 129 days average return to full training. In terms of return to full training, grade ones were obviously a lot less than grade 2 or grade 3, and time to return to full training was increased for grade C intertendon injuries. In terms of re-injuries, grade 3 were most likely, or were significantly more likely to re-injure than grades 1 and 2, and myofascial injuries were much less likely to re-injure than either muscular-tendinous junction or intertendinous injury. So you could potentially be a bit more aggressive with the myofascial. I want to say a big thank you to the guys, British Athletics, particularly in London. Big team there and the good guys. So Ashley Nelson, Michael Afalaka, Francesco Zureb, Ben McDonald, Wendy Hilton, Rob Hill, Noah Pollock, Rob Chack, and the great Michael J. Kuhn, who was there as well. And big thank you to everyone. Really pleased to be involved. And feel free to get in touch on Twitter or email if any questions or anything you want to go through. Thank you very much. I hope that was okay.